Thank you. I'd like to call this work session to order on AO 2020-104, establishing the date of a runoff election within 3 weeks of the date of certification. If we can go ahead and start with a roll call, please.
Yes, Felix Rivera.
Present.
Austin Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Allard. Christopher Constant.
Here.
Forrest Dunbar, I believe he would be excused due to his conflict. Crystal Kennedy.
Here.
Suzanne LaFrance. Cameron Perez Verdilla.
Here.
Pete Peterson.
Present.
And John Weddleton.
Here.
And Meg Zalatel.
I do see Meg as present. She just may not be available right now to say so. Thank you. So with that, as usual, if members would like to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the clerk for the presentation.
Thanks, Felix. So I get the pleasure of being both the clerk and presenting on this proposed ordinance to you. I would like to thank Mr. Peterson, Ms. Allard, and Ms. Kennedy for sponsoring it, as well as Assembly Council Dean Gates, who told us about this inconsistency in the charter and the code. So I would just like to start to walk through the ordinance with you. And the most, I think an easy way to do this is talk about these first two whereases in the proposed ordinance. The first whereas talks about the charter, and the second whereas brings up three provisions in code, one which is consistent with the charter and two which are not. So what the charter says in, and this is detailed in the AIM or the AM, which is part of this ordinance. The charter states, quote, if no candidate for the office of the mayor receives more than 45% of the votes cast for the office of mayor, the assembly within 3 weeks from the date of certification of the election shall hold a runoff election between the two candidates receiving the highest number of votes for the office. So it's clear that the charter
Before
says,
you continue, yes. Madam Clerk, two things. First, just want to
Am I the only one?
Sorry, I think my internet is lagging a little bit this morning. So apologies. I might try to get out of this meeting and come back in. But just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. Zalatel and Ms. Allard. With that, I'm going to try to fix my internet issues. Apologies.
Thank you, Felix. So we're back to the charter that specifically says that it's within 3 weeks of the date of certification. So the next paragraph, the second whereas, indicates one section of the code specifically says the runoff shall be held consistent with the charter. But the next two sections of the code, in fact, I'll start with 2820.010C states, quote, a runoff election required by the results of the regular election shall be held the first Tuesday in May. And the first Tuesday in May is 30 days after the regular election, but it is a lot less than 3 weeks after the date of certification. So this proposal is to make these consistent with the charter. And I'll scoot down here in the ordinance. And so what it does, and I hope you can read that, is it just says that a runoff election required by the results of a regular or special election shall be held within 3 weeks from the date of certification of the election results. So it really shifts the power back to the assembly, because you're the ones that certify rather than just making a runoff on a specific date. So that is probably it from me for the presentation. The proposal is fairly direct. I wonder if Mr. Peterson or Miss Allard or Miss Kennedy may have any comments.
Hi, Barbara. This is Jamie. I want to be able to read it again and digest it a little bit more before I make comments on it. But so far, I'm understanding it. Yeah. I agree with it so far, though. Sorry, the dogs are in the background.
Barbara, I'm in the queue.
Oh, sorry, of
question.
course.
No problem. Yes. This is Mr. Constant. Can I ask a question?
That would be fine with me.
So the 3 weeks issue.
Go ahead, Chris. Sorry,
yeah, thank you.
Felix is working on his internet. Go ahead.
Yeah, so certification would happen on a Tuesday, and the election should happen 3 weeks. So then we know that would be the third Tuesday after the certification. So we don't have some weird problem with, like, it could be several hours late because the polls close at 8 p.m., right? You know, I just don't want to get in a situation where suddenly it's 3 weeks and a day because of clock turn.
No, Christopher, I think that because that term is within, it within means it would be, we wouldn't be counting days necessarily, but it would be within 3 weeks. And I think you're correct. We like Tuesdays because all of the dates that flow, like the notices and filing for office and all of those flow from the date of the election.
Okay, thank you.
Are you chairing, Austin?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, thanks. So, just practical terms, I'm sure you've given lots of thought to this. Given vote by mail, is there time to get ballots printed and get them mailed out in reasonable time? And
Mr. Weddleton, we discussed that a little bit in the last paragraph on the first page of the AM. And it is complicated to prepare for a runoff election, whether you're doing a special or doing a poll-based election or a vote by mail election. We did do a runoff within 30 days in 2015. And the concern that we had at that time, and we noted this in the AM, is that we were publishing notices in the paper about the date of the runoff election before the assembly had certified the election. And that was one of the concerns that we had, and why the clerk's office and the election team are supportive of this. We do think that 3 weeks is probably fine. The code is different for mailing ballots for a runoff election compared to a special or a regular election. So the time period is shortened. So we should be able to do that within 3 weeks.
I guess what is the fastest you could do? Fastest you could do it, reasonably get something printed, get them mailed out.
I'm going to tell you, I don't know the answer to that. some of that depends on our vendors and their workload and busyness. I can tell you that if it was right now, they would laugh at me if I told them I wanted to have a runoff election in 3 weeks, because they're running all of the, many of the general elections that are happening across the country right now. So it depends. I think because we're in April and May, we have a little bit of an advantage there because there aren't a lot of other elections then, but I would need to check with them to confirm that.
That's when we look at April, that makes sense, but a special election could be any time of the year. So we wouldn't want to put this forward and go, well, except we don't mean in October, November, because it takes 4 weeks or something,
So I guess to answer that, Mr. Weddleton, if you're planning a special election that would require a runoff, you may know that in advance and you would plan for that in advance. So when the assembly is developing its call for the special election, it would make that call with the anticipation and understanding of the possibility of runoff. So we would make sure that you knew that in advance of your call for the election.
Okay. Yeah, and I think and I think last time we printed more ballot envelopes than we needed at one of these, the first election, didn't we? So those were used the next year. So is that what you mean when you plan ahead? You say you kind of would do something like that, overprint the envelope so you only have to print the ballots or something.
That is correct, Mr.
But sorry. Thanks. So I'm gonna move us on in the queue. If you have more questions, Mr. Weldon, I'm happy to have you come back into the queue. So no, next I have Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if Austin or Phoenix is chairing now.
This is Felix. Doesn't matter to me though.
So I asked a comment in response to Mr. Constant's question, but I first, I guess, wanted to add to Mrs. Jones' response to Weddleton and about there's a lot of logistics involved, and I would support what Mrs. Jones said. The Assembly calls a special election, and when we realize a special election is needed, we would, of course, be conferring, myself, the clerk's office, maybe even legal, and talking about what, I guess, if it's in October, November, we would take all the logistics into consideration and prepare a resolution for the Assembly, so only the Assembly can call a special election. And at that time, we'd be advising of all these factors affecting logistics, the timing, and so forth. So that's something that would happen. And we would be prepared, as Mrs. Jones said, to advise you about all of those considerations as appropriate. And then I was going to comment on Mr. Constant's concerns about timing and so forth. And I would just wanted to add that typically each year when everything goes well and the elections go smoothly, we certify about 2 weeks, 2 Tuesdays after the election day. But what this language does now, since it's tied to the date of certification, if that's 2 weeks after when everything goes well, great. But suppose something happens, like we did have a fiasco in the late 80s with the election. And I guess maybe some of you remember in 2012, we also have earthquakes and things like that. These things might affect the ability to certify within 2 weeks. So maybe it would be a little later because there's an earthquake on that Tuesday. So this language here says the date of certification is when the trigger for the 3 weeks to hold the runoff election. So it actually gives us the ability to respond to unexpected circumstances when we're looking at certifying and then the time frame for that runoff election. So I thought I would just mention that, and this is helpful as well as having the code chapter regarding emergency circumstances in Title 28 for the election.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're still in the process of making some adjustments to the code to make vote by mail work a little better. The 3 weeks gives us a little more time because sometimes certification is the uncertainty, because if you have an election that's real close, there's recounts, and sometimes if it's within a vote or two, they take it to court. And so the fact that we set it up 3 weeks from certification, in case there's some sort of delay after the original election before we get to the runoff, then we're good to go with this. And the fact that we have our elections in the spring does give us an advantage with the printers, because typically we're the only, or one of a few outfits that they're printing for at that particular time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have too much to add. I think everybody's been explaining pretty well kind of the dynamics of this. And I think to a certain extent, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, because at some point you have to have a deadline. And with this change, you actually have you could potentially have an extra week in there, and you could be having the runoff election the second Tuesday in May. So considering that, you have to have a deadline of sorts, I don't see that we can do too much else other than having the first Tuesday or that 3 weeks after certification. Like I said, I think it kind of all equals out to a certain extent. But again, we've got to have a specific deadline in code. So thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a suggestion for the AM as we move closer to this being before the body, is that it would be great if there was some kind of table with potential actual dates of how this would play out. I think this is confusing to keep all the pieces, straight. And to explain it to the public. So I just want to kind of put that idea out there. If there's some easier way that we can express or show how the ordinance will play out, or the change, I think that's really important, so that everyone's on the same page, at least how it will play out, for 2021, as we talk about particularly the regular mayoral election. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. 2 things. First, to the question of timing and crunches. Barbara, I think what I would suggest that happen is that your staff begin developing a standard format runoff ballot that gets preset with the printers, that we can have from now until forever, that just gets adjusted with 4 lines of detail or 6 lines of detail, dates, names, etc. And in that way, we can avoid kind of if and when the scenario hits us, at least that part of the scenario, so that you already have a document in place that the printer approves, and you're only one step from getting it sent out. So I think that's one thing for your team to consider preparing. And then the second is, I don't know what this debate really is about. I think that the charter is our essential document. It's primary, number one, other than the state and US constitutions. And so I don't know how much wiggle room we have. I think that we have to ensure that our code is in line with the charter, lest the election be challenged on the basis that it's out of compliance with our fundamental documents. And so I'm not sure that too much debate is warranted, that we have to do this. We just have to make sure the language of the code and the charter are unified or harmonious.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else in the queue. Madam Clerk, did you have any other parts of the presentation or any other discussion?
No, Mr. Chair.
All right. Is there any other questions or discussion from the members? Okay, not hearing any, then I will go ahead and close this work session and we will see each other at 11 a.m.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.